Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to resilience, business continuity, crisis management, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. You can find me on LinkedIn. I am the only Alex Fullick there. I'm really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. As you can see on the screen, today is my favorite returning guest because, she's been back so many times. And I didn't tell her this before we started recording, but today is the 50th episode.
Wow.
Regina Phelps and I have been talking. Regina, welcome back for episode 50.
Wow, that's huge. That's totally huge. Thank you so much. It's such a great pleasure to have talked to you 50 times. Oh, Lord.
And to think we started this, back in November, just before the pandemic, November
Yes. Yeah. Oh,
2019.
gosh.
And
Yes.
we've been
Yes.
doing it ever since.
Yes. 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 So thank you. It's a delight to be with you. And of course, I have lots to talk about.
Yeah, there's something about that too. Once again, I get the feeling we're not going to be talking about bunnies and rainbows.
No, 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 no. Someday, maybe. I know we always say that we're going to do that, but we haven't got to that point yet, unfortunately.
So what are we going to talk about today?
Well, I have some things on my mind, and what I want to talk about are things that I think would be helpful for all of our colleagues. And they're really under the big umbrella of the risks that we're facing right now. And so I have a couple things I want to share. We're going to talk about the World Economic Forum, in particular, their global risk report that came out actually in the early part of January. And it's really important. And we're going to start there, and then we're going to sort of peel back that and see what else turns up in the course of our conversation. We're going to start there. And I do have some slides that I need to share as part of that. Is this
Great.
a good time to toss them up?
Sure.
Cool. All right, let's do it. So, as I mentioned, the issue related to the Economic Forum in particular is the report that they issue every year. Now, they've been doing this for the last 20 years, but let me just talk for a moment about the World Economic Forum because a lot of our listeners may have heard of them, but they actually don't know who they are. So, the World Economic Forum has actually been around since 1971, and it's actually, think of it like a global think tank. And what it is it's comprised of government leaders, academicians, all kinds of activists, people from industry. It's a mass of folks that come together every year, and then they work together throughout the year on a variety of issues. But when they come together annually, it's a big deal. And it's actually one of the most important events, if you will, for global thinkers annually. It actually is it's a not-for-profit foundation, actually, and it's actually based in Geneva. One of the things that they started doing about 20 years ago, in fact, this is their anniversary, was they actually came out with something called the Global Risk Report. I've been reading it since 2005. Have you ever looked at it before,
I
Alex?
have looked at it a few times. I have to admit, not on a consistent basis, but a few times, yes.
It's actually one of the things that I really encourage my clients and everybody in our profession to look at. It usually comes out, they do the survey during the late summer, and it usually comes out around the end of November. And then the conference in Davos for the World Economic Forum is in January. Now, when this comes out, it actually does a deep dive into looking at what's going to be going on in the world and their belief. And they look at it from the period of right now, as well as what's going to be going on in 2 years and what's going to go on in 10 years. And so what happens with this particular report is that everybody does what's called a temperature check. And so I find it super helpful. I work all over the world, and I like to know what folks are thinking about and what they think the big risks might be. And so the risks are really complex, and frankly, they're often pretty alarming sometimes, but they're very incisive. And so the hope of all of this is that people will look at these risks, they'll come together in Davos in January, and they'll really talk about what can we do about them. And that's really important, right? So it's not just, that they're doing this for fun and then they don't talk about it. This is what the whole forum is based around, are these big risks. So this year, And I'm asking all of our listeners to actually spend just a moment, make a note, and know that you need to go find the Global Risk Report for 2025. This is the 20th year anniversary. And I'll tell you, it's intense, is all I can say. People think I'm intense. Oh my God. So what it first reveals in just blatant terms, remember the questions were asked last August. So it's not like it was asked yesterday or in January. So it looks at a fractured global landscape, and it looks about the escalating geopolitical issues which are everywhere, the continuing unraveling of the environment, and huge societal and technology changes that are really affecting the globe. And so they actually describe their own report in one word: bleak. Now that's, I don't know about you, but that's just sort of like, whoa. I mean, it's very sobering. I don't, the difference between sobering and bleak is a pretty big difference in my mind of words, right? I
Yeah.
mean, but it is, when you look at it, and we'll talk about it, it makes you just your head spin a little bit. Now, this is important in our work. I just want to give you a sense of how critical it is for us to understand really how people are perceiving the real risks that are we are all facing around the world, and then by regions. And so that's why we're going to spend a little bit of time on this. And what you're actually seeing, and this is again, remember these people were surveyed in August of last year. It really is reflecting this incredible paradigm shift that's happening globally. Increased instability, increasing polarization across the globe, and then a huge increase in trust and insecurity. And I also want to just tie back to many things that you and I have talked about for a long time, and that's the post-pandemic landscape. And that's where we are, my friend. And that's really what they're
Mhm.
talking about. So I didn't make up all that stuff, is what I guess I'm saying. But so anyway, this is kind of the measuring stick that they use, and this is what you and I are going to banter back and forth here a little bit. When they ask everybody to look at a variety of different issues globally, they actually are asking them to always evaluate them utilizing what I call a measuring stick, but it's a scale essentially. Where the most pessimistic are the people that are the most concerned and kind of anxious, if you will. They're in what's called, they're a stormy kind of, so they see things as globally catastrophic, and things, can be really significant. And then it kind of goes to the very other end of that spectrum, which is calm, which there's very little risk of a global catastrophe. And then, as you can see from the categories, there's turbulent, there's unsettled, and there's stable. And so what it is simply starting with the very worst, as you might imagine, right? Big global catastrophes, and then kind of moving from that into the very end, which is calm. So what they do is they ask all of the participants in the study to look at a whole category of topics, and they ask them to evaluate them based on these 5 different measures. And again, it's about what do you feel? How do you feel right now? What are you thinking about in 2 years? And what are you thinking about in 10 years? So that's what the landscape of the report is. Now, what they do is that they're also looking at 5 other things. So they have them evaluate things in 5 categories. But what the categories that they're evaluating, there are 5 of those too. And they're basically economic categories. There are things related to the environmental issues. There are the geopolitical issues. There are the societal issues. And then lastly, there are the technology issues. And so everybody looks at these 5 categories, and they are asked different questions, and they evaluate them on the stormy through calm options. So if you stop and look at this for a minute, and this is almost where I would ask anybody who's looking on this on YouTube, you could just stop as you're, and hopefully they've downloaded the report. You can stop and look at this, and what you can begin to see is how one thing impacts the other thing. Nothing really is in a vacuum. So if you have, for example, a lot of inequality, and they believe that that's actually one of the greatest threats in the world, inequality, with many people having very few opportunities or advantages, and how that impacts societally, the decline in health and well-being. And then the other big red one you'll see is social polarization. But what you notice is that they all begin to touch and feed each other, right? So if you have a lot of inequality, then that means that you have a lack of opportunity, and that means you're much more likely to have to leave your homeland and go someplace else with immigration. And that, so it all begins to attach with each other. And you can see that, social polarization is immediately connected to mis and disinformation. So it doesn't sit every dot there is not solitary. We all touch each other. So does that make sense as you look at
Yeah,
it?
I think it's impossible for anything to exist on its own these days.
Exactly. Exactly.
A person can't. So how can the our surroundings be?
Exactly. And what I find this is actually helpful just for, and this is if you're watching it on YouTube or you're looking at the global risk report, don't blast by this because it really just just take a moment to look at it and begin to actually understand how these things are all connected to each other and how those connections impact each other and compound each other. And so I think it's really important. But there's one big thing that, besides the inequality issue, that I want to call out. And that is one of the biggest drivers that we're experiencing. You and I have talked about this a lot over the last 3 or 4 years in particular, is the driver of a lot of this being mis and disinformation. And we'll talk about that later. But I think that is, and I don't have any kind of an answer for that unless you unplugged the internet.
You know what? That might be a good idea for a week.
Yeah, no kidding,
See what
man.
happens.
Yeah, right. Because we are so connected and everybody can tune into their own echo chamber of choice that I don't know how you get over the mis and disinformation piece. But we'll talk more about that later. So this is what the first survey is. Remember, they look at what's happening now, what's happening in 2 years, do you think, and what's happening and be happening in 10. This is what they viewed were the greatest risks right now. So this is in the now moment. And you'll see the first one, I've never had seen this before, which was state-based conflict, armed conflict. Certainly Ukraine being a big driver of that, but not just Ukraine, my friend. The threats of Putin in the Baltics, for example, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Those places are actually, I don't know if I follow all of this news pretty closely, and they're actually planting landmines now along the Russian border, which is like unheard of. And not a time of war, but this time, there's constantly these little efforts to sort of stick their toes in all the way along the border. And many of these borders are quite remote. And so there's a lot of pushing and pulling back and forth right now across all three of those countries. So they actually are dropping in landmines, which I was shocked, right? In a non-war environment.
To be honest, I'm not. And the
Mhm.
reason being is I've been to Tallinn, Estonia,
Mhm.
and when I was talking with people there, um, yeah, they still had a fear of Russia coming back, and that was 10, 12 years ago.
So can you imagine how they feel now?
Yeah, yeah,
Because basically the general belief is, Ukraine first and then the Baltics.
yeah.
So that's one part of the world where the conflict opportunities are quite high. The second place is actually Taiwan and China. And there's a lot happening over there, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. The next one, so it's big, state conflict and lots of issues in different parts of the world. The next one is all of the extreme weather events, which of course is driven by climate change. And all you have to do is look at the fires in LA this year as a good example of catastrophe, right? Then it's geoeconomic confrontation, and that's things like tariffs.
Yeah.
And you would know that as a Canadian, as I sit here as a United States citizen.
Yes, know all about that right
Yes,
now.
you do, man. And it's not just you, it's Mexico and a lot of other countries right now. So that geoeconomic confrontation is where you have money and essentially in the economy, and you're basically, head knocking with each other. The next one is misinformation and disinformation. I'm actually personally surprised it's low, but I mean the other two things above it or three things above it are also incredibly amazingly challenging. So, but we've talked a lot about that, and we'll talk a lot more on this session. The next one is societal polarization, where we are now being pinned against each other, essentially. And look at just us with between with the new administration and the issues related to tariffs and kind of push and pull across both Mexico, Canada, and now, of course, the rest of the world as he's rolling out tariffs in many other different places. And then that leads to economic downturn, which we've already seen a very volatile stock market here in the United States. That's not going to change at any time soon. And there's one here that should make people pause, even though it's at the bottom of this list, which is critical change to Earth systems. So there's a lot of environmental researchers that are very concerned about the currents in the Atlantic. And so this is not tides, these are currents, which are very, very deep, really at the base of the ocean. And they go in a particular direction, and they actually move the heat and the cold around the world, essentially. And there are some signs that they're actually starting to slow down. And there's a belief, as places like Greenland and the Arctic get warmer, that the actual current will reverse, which would have incredibly devastating effects to weather worldwide. And so there's a lot of people that are seriously pondering that. Now, that's for another day, but that should leave people, I mean, that's worth even sort of Googling a little bit. It's pretty mind-blowing. We're not going to talk about it today, though. So that's how people are feeling right this moment. What do you think about that? How, when you think about your own life, when you think about what's going on in Canada, and even try and just imagine this happened, again, they asked these questions in August of last year, but based on what you think right now, how you're feeling this moment, what do you think of that list?
I think it's pretty accurate with what's going on
Mm-hmm.
because state-based armed conflicts, you mentioned Ukraine, the
Yep.
Baltics, there's the Houthis, is it Yemen,
Right.
Yemen,
Mm-hmm.
and Taiwan and China. There's threats all over the place, even threats to overtake my own country here,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
as well as armed conflict to take over Panama, or
Mm-hmm.
sorry, the Panama Canal, I should say, not the country, the Panama Canal, taking Greenland. That's all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is a key one, and that in itself is related to quite a few of the other ones that are below it.
Right.
The geopolitical, geoeconomic confrontations, the misinformation and disinformation fuels conspiracy theories about everything. So
And the
this time,
polarization, right?
yeah,
Because we're
that
all
which
kind of
creates
angry at each other.
polarization. Yeah, it's created a polarization between American and Canadians, and we were neighbors that got along for well over 100 years since
Yeah.
we became a country in 1867,
Yep.
and that's not well. There's a divide there now
Yeah, and it's
after all that
tragic.
time,
Yeah.
and even within the U.S., you
Mm-hmm.
had a group who could work together, Democrat and Republican. That divide is now getting wider and harder to work together.
Yes.
So it's
Yes.
happening everywhere, neighbor against neighbor, state against state,
Mm-hmm.
province against province.
Mm-hmm.
Up here, it's
Mm-hmm.
happening everywhere.
Yeah. 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 And so I think, yeah, I mean, these are important things, and many of our colleagues may say, well, what does it have to do with my job in business continuity or whatever, their task is within our collective field? And that is that all of these things are connected. And so again, we certainly all remember what we experienced during the supply chain issues of COVID. Any of these things that occur have the great potential of really impacting supply chains, which really impacts many, many, many businesses, but it impacts everybody personally in their life if it doesn't impact your business. I mean, just in the cost of goods, et cetera. So these things are important, even though you may not be able to draw a straight line necessarily into the work that you might be doing in your organization. But I think in our field, it's really important that we have some sense of these things because it can have long-term impacts and certainly impacts on supply chains, which will affect many, many businesses.
Yeah, even if I drew that map that you showed a little earlier, a few minutes ago, if I did that based on myself, I may not have a direct impact to something in China, but if I or something in Taiwan or something in the UK, but if I want to buy a new computer, yeah, I might be
You
impacted,
certainly do.
just not a direct line,
Yeah.
because of what Taiwan produces for us on all the microchips and
Hmm.
things like that. So it's not a direct line for me, but it does impact me.
Hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Exactly.
What's the saying? You know what trickles down?
Yeah.
Well,
Let's see. Yeah, I do know that. I do know that phrase. I love it. Well, then, so this, remember, this is now. So then they ask, okay, look forward 2 years. And I just want you to sort of, note what our choices are here, because you'll see them really change when we get to the next 2 years. So 2 years from now. So 2 years and 10 years. Okay, so remember, we're looking at 5 categories: economic, environmental, geopolitical, societal, and technology. And then we're asking essentially 5 questions, the stormy all the way through the calm. And that's what they're using to grade all of this. So notice the immediate shift, first of all, in the 2 year box. The first option, mis and disinformation. And I think that's when you look, I think there's the short term where you're looking at what's going to happen right now, and you're looking at all the things we just mentioned, like the geo conflicts, et cetera. But then I think when you're looking over this 2 year period, I think now people pull back a little bit, and what they're looking at is really what's driving the majority of the issues that we're facing. And it really boils down to mis and disinformation. And that's one thing I have thought about so long and hard. And back in the old days, it was easy to try and manage information. Now it's not. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but I don't know how you change that. I just don't know unless you unplug the internet. And we'll talk more, but I mean, to me, this gives me kind of a big kind of, my brain just doesn't know what to do with it, because the problem is so huge.
Mhm. Yeah, it's bigger than just unplugging the internet, because now when you meet people and they just kind of have those crazy comments, that they used to years ago, and you're just like, yeah, okay, Betty's off a rocker, or
Right, right,
Sam
right.
is like just thinking bizarre things, that's just him, don't worry about it. But now with all the social media platforms, now they have a way to get those crazy thoughts out.
Right. And they do.
Yeah, and they do. And because some people, many people are so, well, really all of us are new to, social media platforms.
Sure.
We haven't had them for decades, and or 100 years or something. It's relatively new. So all this information gets thrown out there, and people start believing wrong stuff because they really don't know how
Right.
to distinguish between what's real and what's not.
Yeah. Yep.
In the old days before internet, you went to the library and looked at Encyclopedia Britannica. Well, you
Yeah, we
don't
all
do
did
that
that.
now. Yeah,
Yeah,
you
we all
don't
did
do
that.
that now.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's true. It's true. It's a mammoth problem. But I think that's very telling to me, is that that's the number one perceived issue, which because it feeds, to me, it feeds everything else,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So then the whole issue of extreme weather then pops up. And again, remember, that's feeding hurricanes, tornadoes, severe wildfires. Look at Canada, right? Look at the United States. And then all the other cascading weather impacts that you see because of that. And then we have the state-based conflict. And then we have social polarization, which we saw before. And now we get into some other things you didn't see before in the short term, which is cyber espionage and warfare. So that's like, again, the one that I always remind my clients about is that the one that's still a huge mystery, even if it has been solved or not, and that's in the United States, is Salt Typhoon. And Salt Typhoon, of course, is the Chinese hacking of all, I'm going to use the word all, American telecommunications companies. And that was revealed over the course of maybe 6 months ago. And they still don't know if they got them all out. I
Yeah.
mean, and they're just really clear. We don't know. So, I mean, we don't know. To me, that with that said, and I think we might have even talked about this before, we don't even know if they're in every one of our electrical grid, major contractors and subcontractors, and we don't know if they're in the water systems, and we don't know if they're, in pumping fuel on big pipelines, and we don't know any of that. And you probably in Canada don't know either. Because if people have gotten in, we have no idea. And if they're really good at their ability to hide, then wow. And so what could happen if there is some sort of armed conflict or state-related issue is that if people are in systems, they can start, turning them off at the
Mhm.
very fortuitous times, right, for them. And that's just what we aren't clear about. So then pollution in general, so things like, when you see pipelines that are broke or mining accidents where they're releasing large amounts of heavy metals into bodies of water and things like that. Inequality, which drives many things. And certainly when you look at many parts of the world where young men in particular, in Africa, both that and Saudi and in the Middle East, where they don't have any work opportunities. And so they become, again, very frustrated. And so they can't get married, they can't have kids, blah, 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 blah. They can't earn a living. And then they start going other places. And then that gets to all of the immigration issues that you see all over the world.
Mhm.
And that goes to involuntary migration and displacement, right? The reason you're moving is because you have no choice. You're going to starve to death.
Yeah.
And geoeconomic confrontation, that's tariffs and things like that. And then the last one is the erosion of human rights and civic freedoms. So that's in a 2-year category. So we'd be having that conversation, roughly about now, 2 years from now.
Be interesting to see what that looks like in 2
Yeah,
years.
I think we should actually peel
Okay.
some of these back. In fact, I actually might do that where I actually pull some of the old ones up and see what they thought. I bet it's really so different than they imagined because of the mis and disinformation in particular. Because
Mhm.
that's new. That's relatively new. I think it was there last year, but not the year before.
Hmm.
And then you look at the 10 years, and now again, what people are looking at with a longer lens is really more about climate change issues and those kinds of things that are really in people's minds in 10 years from now. Extreme weather of all kinds, and then you'll see new things like the loss of biodiversity and how that's going to impact food supply systems all around the world, pollinators like bees, all of those things that could impact us. And then the critical change to earth systems, so more about the deep currents in the Atlantic, natural resources shortages, and then other things that we've seen before. But you'll see that in the longer vision, it turns out to be more about environmental issues, at least now, than in the short term or in the 2-year period.
Interesting. I
Hmm.
see pollution in there. Uh,
Yeah.
in 10 years, pollution drops, which is
Yeah,
interesting.
which is interesting, right? And I think that's probably because it's been so effective, it actually has created many of the problems that you see at the top,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So then the loss of biodiversity is risen because the pollution has been so effective. So effective. Oh gosh. Should we take a
Wow.
break or do you want me to keep
Yeah.
going?
Let's take a break and
Okay.
then we'll come back and we'll either continue closing off on this one or we'll move to our other topic.
Okay.
Okay. Today we're talking with Regina Phelps on episode number 50, and we will be right back. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.